My name is Wendy Bouillon-Winters, and I'm Director General and Head of Human Resources at the school. It's my pleasure to welcome you today as I moderate a discussion with some experts to explore the importance of collecting strong disaggregated data and how it can be used as a critical tool in dismantling systemic barriers that exist in the federal public service. Our discussion promises to be inspiring. Mais d'abord, je tiens à reconnaître que...
But first of all, I would like to acknowledge that I am on the traditional unceded Anishinaabe territory. I recognize that we all work in different places, and therefore you work on a different traditional indigenous territory. I encourage you to take a moment to reflect on this. I am happy to introduce today's event entitled Disaggregated Data, a Tool for Dismantling Systemic Barriers in the Federal Public Service. This is for marginalized Canadian citizens who are judged based on their origins.
Simultaneous interpretation is available so that you may follow in the official language of your choice. To make your viewing experience better, we encourage you to disconnect from the VPN if possible and reconnect to the event. We want today's event to be interactive, so please use the raised hand function to submit your questions for the panelists. There is someone monitoring the inbox and they'll send them to me. Lastly, these conversations can be emotional for some people, so I encourage you to take care of yourself and your mental health. Take a break if you need to, and reach out to resources such as the Employee Assistance Program. So let's get started. It's my pleasure to introduce Caroline Xavier, Associate Deputy Minister of Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada. Ms. Xavier has over 30 years of experience in the public service. Before joining IRCC, she held several other senior appointments, including as Assistant Secretary at PCO and as co-chair to the Cabinet Committee on Global Affairs and Public Security. She also held positions at CBSA, CSE, Industry Canada, and CRA. Welcome, Caroline, and thank you for your time today.
Merci beaucoup, Wendy. Vraiment content.
Thank you very much, Wendy. I am very happy to be among you this afternoon.
To take a minute to just thank the Canada School of the Public Service as well as the Federal Black Employee Caucus for inviting me to talk today. Vraiment, comme je vous ai dit, un plaisir d'être ici avec vous.
It's a great pleasure to be among you today.
Acknowledging, as Wendy did, that for those of us in Ottawa, the land on which we gather is the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. En ce dernier mois de 2020,
on this last month of 2020, we are thinking about a very exceptional year, and it was certainly not ordinary.
Dominated by the pandemic, has also been one where many have turned their attention to the issue of racial discrimination and its impacts in our society, in our systems and institutions. Many countries around the world have been struggling with this issue of systemic and institutional racism. And in fact, the pandemic has highlighted inequities with its higher infection rates amongst racialized individuals. A lot of the coverage of racist incidents coming from the US has really raised our awareness. But let's be clear, Canada has its own share of examples as well, and also struggles with the issue of racism. Our communities and institutions are just as prone to acts of discrimination and intolerance as we have seen in the US. Le racisme systématique et institutionnel.
Systemic and institutional racism, as well as brutality and prejudices, were highlighted as never before. The shocking stories that we hear about are the situations that we witness require an all-front intervention, including within the public service in Canada.
Effort in many federal departments, including my own at Immigration, Refugee, Citizenship Canada, to begin the dialogue and work towards actions to address the problems and to set a course for a more equitable and respectful workplace. I'm thrilled that Farah Boisclair, who's our director leading our departmental anti-racism task force, is taking a critical look at addressing racism within our own department. The task force has posted career opportunities within the department, published sounding board on racial microaggressions, put out an article to talk about how to talk about race, has invited employees to participate in several town halls on racism, and is hosting a series of trust circles and conversations with people of Black, Indigenous, and people of color, some of which I personally have had the privilege to participate in. The department has conducted an anti-racism employee survey in collaboration with the Departmental Circle for Visible Minorities and various groups across the department to deepen our understanding of critical issues related to racism in the workplace and to examine its impacts on productivity, health and wellness, and the psychological impacts, safety, and organizational culture and other key areas, but also to help us explore our departmental disaggregated data. The task force will continue to focus on fostering discussions and creating safer spaces. It will also make a comprehensive assessment of institutional racism within IRCC and present a multi-year strategy to address it. Together, we are aiming to make important and lasting changes in our department. Comme nous l'avons dit,
as we said in the past, we don't just take one measure. There is not a single solution or a temporary solution. We need a global reconstruction. We want to make sustainable changes in the way we work and in the way we deal with one another. But this will require time.
Is to make our workplace more inclusive for everyone, regardless of their background. As we increase our equity and foster an inclusive work environment, we lay a foundation for a better future. But this is not just a departmental priority. It's also a top priority across the public service, including and especially at the most senior levels. We have spent the last few months listening to our colleagues, and we continue to do so, and also to listen to our staff and what we need to do. In order to ensure we are on the right track, it is important to reflect on what we're hearing and on the many conversations and the relevance that data is telling us as a story. L'une des choses la plus importantes.
One of the most important things that we can do right now is to have transparency in our efforts and in the results of our efforts. A strong disaggregated data can be used as a key tool to dismantle systemic obstacles which remain within the public service of Canada. These measures are essential if we want to improve the representation of people coming from marginalized communities.
Equity report. The government is now making disaggregated data available with respect to diversity of the public service. Previously, this information had been available every 5 years as part of the census package, but now this is a resource that is accessible to anyone at any time. Now everybody can see where we need to improve. Ces statistiques sont significant.
Such statistics are significant for me as an executive. Because I'm an executive, I want to make sure that the Canadian Public Service is taking full advantage of its pool of talents. We have to build a culture of equality and equal opportunities so that people can climb up the ladder along with their peers. Of course, there remains a lot to be done, and this will not be done overnight.
To strengthen positive values and the actions that back them up. Every project or initiative, every conversation, no matter the subject, is a chance to improve the way we treat people and the way we treat each other and work together. With the release of this disaggregated data, the government has provided a window on the movement for change. And this information will expose the problem in greater detail and show the work we need to do to create a better future. That's a tremendous challenge to take up. I encourage each and every one of us to recognize the power we all have to transform the public service for Canadians and the need for us to do it together. Donc, je vous remercie.
So thank you very much. Wendy, I'll give you the floor back.
Thank
you, Caroline.
Thank you very much for providing today's opening remarks. We really appreciate it. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers for today. The first of which joins us from the Atlantic region, Kathy Lusk.
Good afternoon. Bon après-midi tout le monde. My name is Kathy Lusk. I am the Director of Integrity Services at Service Canada. Je suis directrice des...
I am Director, Integrity and National Services, Atlantic Canada region.
To data. Data for me is how I got my first ever federal government job. I started out as a student with HRDC. That was our name at the time. Ironically, we've come full circle. And at the time, they were recruiting equity and diversity students. The numbers weren't there. We weren't diverse enough. And this was a mechanism they were using as part of their staffing strategy to increase that representation. We'll talk a little bit about that later in terms of a strategy. But ultimately, I was 16, I was in high school, and the principal made an announcement over the loudspeaker, and he said, any Black kids who are looking for jobs, go down to the Student Employment Center. That's how it was put out there. And the first thing was, why just the Black students? And the second thing was, oh, that's me. I want a job. Had no clue what it was, didn't know anything about it, but I wanted to be employed. I did not come from a family with money. I did not care with which the message was delivered. Now, hindsight is 2020, of course, not necessarily the way we want to be introduced, but I walked myself down to that Student Employment Center, not even remotely knowing what I was about to get myself into. So I walked in and I said, I'd like a job. They said, at school, you're looking for Black kids. I was 16, I didn't know anything, and this was going to be my opportunity. And they handed me a 9-page application, and it had over 120 bubble sparks on it that I had to mark off in terms of experience. And the first thing I realized is I had no idea what language was being communicated to me, what I was supposed to do with that. And it was my first experience, ironically, in understanding that staffing can be a bit of a barrier for equity and diversity groups. It's challenging on the best of days for all of us, but it takes time. So I sat and I completed the application with my mother, and she helped me out understanding, you know, this is what this means, this is what that means. And we got to the part about self-identification. And it asked me, am I a visible minority? Am I an Aboriginal person? Am I a woman? Do I have a disability? And 3 of those boxes were yeses, but it said it's voluntary. So I just said, oh, I'm not going to fill it out. No problem. So I marched my application back in, and they told me you can't have the job unless you identify you're part of the visible minority group. You have to say that you're Black. And I didn't understand, but I checked it off because I wanted the job. And then I went home and I said to my mother, I said, why do I have to say what I am to get a job? Do other people have to do that? And she said, no. She said, but they're probably trying to track it. And then she said, do you want the job? And I said, yes. And she said, well, my second question to you is, what does it matter? Do you think they don't see you coming? They can tell. And she was teaching me a bit of a harsh lesson. It was funny, but it was harsh in that people will see me coming. They will recognize that I'm different, and they're going to make decisions based on that. And that became a bit of a message for me throughout my career, because that's what does happen now. As I walk around as an executive in government today, people have perceptions. We all have biases, no matter what race, culture, creed. We make judgments, and then that manifests itself into what can be, you know, sometimes a difficult environment as an executive in the Atlantic region, as well as Ottawa. I can't tell you how many times I've been asked whose secretary I am. Who do you belong to? What are you doing here? Where are you from, and what are you? You know, as if I don't belong, I shouldn't be there. As a Black woman who is outside as an executive, I'm frequently still followed around in stores. I'm called derogatory names on the street. I'm asked when I get to the cash, do you really think that you can afford that? Those are biases, perceptions, that's racism, that's discrimination, all that is present and actively in our environment as we speak. And I don't tell you that to create shame or to create guilt, but to create awareness that individuals and employment equity and diversity groups deal with these every day still. It can be invisible to you if you're not experiencing it, but it's there and it's happening. And the important thing is ignorance can't be the block. Once you become aware, you become empowered, and then you can use the information that's available to you to assist in contributing as an ally or working to improve the situation, and as Caroline noted, working to change the situation. So we tend to make decisions and assumptions based on the information that we've received by media and sources. In government, that's reports and data. We go based on numbers. My background is staffing. I currently work in fraud, which I love, but as I say, my mothership is HR. I love it. Finding people jobs, helping people through things is a bit of magic, and I really appreciate that work and still cling to it. But what I found is there are some little tricky loopholes there. And what we find, for example, is within equity and diversity communities, being a Black person, there's a bit of mistrust. I did not start to self-identify after I became a student until I was about 26. I still didn't want to give that information. I didn't think it was right. And I was in HR. I knew the power of that data. I knew what it would do. It would give my presence. It would let them know I was here. It would also inform HR planning, right? Very critical. But I also found out that where there are so few people like me in the organization, in a small department, if there are less than 10, I believe, they won't share that data for risk of my privacy being violated. So there's a bit of a catch-22 there. We need the data. We need to trust enough to self-identify. And if enough of us don't self-ID, then unfortunately what we're looking at is a situation where we don't get that data that we value so much to help us fix it, which means we need to focus on other things. We need to be using data, information, and numbers, but we also need to do our research. We need to communicate. We need to talk to everybody in employment equity and diversity groups to understand the issues. I would like to say we only look at data often in one way. So those students that come in, those employment equity and diversity students, those casual individuals that come in on a temporary basis, boost those representation numbers. They look great. They look really high. These people work really hard. And then at the end of the summer, the numbers go down because they go back to school. So we're not doing sustainable representation. We need to make sure that our HR planning is consistent, that it's solid, and that it's built for retention. We need to look at our indeterminate data. And so looking at employment equity and diversity numbers, what are they now and what are they historically? And if they're going down, we need to find out why people aren't staying. What is the experience? Because I can tell you, in my experience, being the only one in the room, up until very recently on my executive team, being the only Black person at the table in my room is not necessarily always a fun place to be. It brings a tremendous amount of pressure. It brings guilt. You need to succeed because you're succeeding on behalf of who you're representing. You're also often unfairly held accountable to represent an entire group, an entire culture. But I can tell you, I don't know what it's like to be a Black man, and I can't certainly speak to another Black woman's experience. So we need to look at data in multiple ways. We need to use it in multiple ways. And we need to create an environment where culturally people feel safe to put the information out there and be represented rather than counted and tracked. That's not a fun thing to be. Nobody wants to be counted and tracked, right? And in addition, we have a great opportunity. As a self-professed staffing nerd, I can say with new rules in staffing, flexibilities, we have the opportunity to really change the dynamic around our processes. Government of Canada staffing is not an easy thing for anyone, even when you're in HR, even if you're a hiring manager and you built a process, the next time you apply, it's a challenge, it's a barrier. But to equity and diversity groups, there are barriers around how to apply. There are barriers around language, technology. We have those biases that we incorporate. If you are creating staffing tools, we're typically creating them based on our experiences. So in an environment that is largely Caucasian, that experience is not reflective of what I would necessarily be experiencing and might put me at a disadvantage. So I'd encourage you to go to the Public Service Commission, for example. They've got a great guide on inclusivity with regards to staffing processes, and look at the information that you're seeing, look at your biases, because we certainly do have them, and try to add to that knowledge. What we want to do in this environment is grow the knowledge and share information. And I would encourage us all to be fearless in terms of asking questions and getting answers. if we create a safe environment where people can discuss racism, we can discuss the data, then that is going to open more doors to us making progress and having success and breaking down those barriers and eliminating racism in the workplace. And I'm going to stop there and send it back to Wendy. Thank you.
Thanks, Kathy. I mean, just, very, very interesting insights across a kind of myriad of thematics there that I hope we'll have a chance in our short discussion today to touch on many of these. And before we do that, start that discussion, I'll just continue in introducing the rest of our speakers. Over to you, Stevan Zonich. Zonich, sorry.
No problem.
Stevan.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Stevan Zonich. I'm a director of surveys team responsible for the Public Service Employees Survey within OCRO TBS. As many as you know, the PSCS is one of the key people management data instruments that allows the Federal Public Service to identify what is doing well and what could be done better to ensure the continuous improvement of the people management practices in the government. Since this survey has been conducted since 1999 and up to 2017, it was a triennial survey, so it was conducted every 3 years. However, in 2018, decision was made to conduct this survey annually. So this year's survey is basically our third iteration of the annual survey. So we are quite happy with that just because of the richness information that's being collected in this survey is enormous. The 2020 PSCS is a comprehensive survey that is capturing the information on employee perceptions and opinions about their engagement, leadership, workforce, workplace well-being, compensation, diversity, inclusion, and impact of COVID-19. From the diversity and inclusion perspective, the PSCS has evolved tremendously over the past several years. In 2017, we added a third gender option to our gender question. In 2018, sexual orientation question was added as one of the demographic questions in our survey. So that way we can actually analyze the lived experience of our employees that are part of the LGBTQ2+ community. In 2019, questions on the employment equity groups. We have added the questions on the subgroups so that we can actually drill down even further when it comes to lived experience of our employees that are members of employment equity groups. And finally, in this year's survey, we have added 4 questions specific to racism and anti-racism across the public service of Canada. As I said, this year's survey, actually it's already launched this Monday. We are going to continue to promote the survey until the survey closes till January 22nd, 2021. Data will be released in the spring of 2021 with the first wave of public service-wide results, with the parliamentary results highly likely available sometime in mid-April, and then organization unit results available later in May. We are also planning to do thematic data releases that are aligned with national, international events like Black History Month, International Day of Women, etc. At the same time, this year's survey is really critical considering the environment that we currently live in, and it is actually going to be a benchmark year for us when it comes to the lived experience of our employees during the COVID-19 situation. So I strongly encourage everybody to fill the survey and make your voice heard. And I sincerely hope that all of you have received your survey link from our service provider, Advanis. Thank you.
Thank you, Stevan. Exactly. We've, as heads of HR, we've been promoting the survey to our staff as well. It's just a really unprecedented time, and more than ever, we need to hear from our employees. So thank you for that. And over to Jason Lawson. Bonjour, Jason.
Hello, Jason. Hello, Wendy. So I am Jason Lawson, Director, Experimentation and Partnership Team in the HR Division. And I would like to address the modernization of the self-identification project. Kathy already mentioned this briefly in her introduction and in her experience, and I will tell you more about the way we try to improve the system. So, as you know, the government has to collect data on employment equity, and these data are help the government understand progress in terms of representation, hiring, promotion, and exit rates. So they have to be accurate in order to determine or to develop policies and interventions to support employment equity. The way we collect data, well, we do this through voluntary declarations that employees within each organization or departments provide. We give minimal standards for such questionnaires, but the departments and institutions can add specific questions according to their environment. Only self-identifying employees may be considered as such for statistical purposes to determine their representativity within the public service. What are the issues involved? Employment equity is difficult to determine in the current environment because the questionnaire is applied inconsistently. The fact that a number of people don't self-identify, and we don't know exactly what this rate is. And we don't really understand why people decide to identify or not to self-identify. So this is really an issue of confidence. So what are we trying to do? We are trying to modernize the self-identification process and the experience around it. And we will have 4 phases: the phase of understanding, design, implementation, and tests, and then recommendations for the system. So I will tell you about all this. So as far as understanding is concerned, this is qualitative research. So it means that we have to do a literature review, surveys, and workshops that we do with the HR community and with employment equity groups. We also review the administrative data that are available, and we do also research throughout the Government of Canada. And we have an advisory committee in order to guide the process that we're working with, which has 3 different groups. So first, we have a research group on employment equity, including people who are not considered as being members of a visible minority group. So we work with many networks who deal with this issue. The second committee, the HR professionals, specifically people who represent each department and who work on diversity and inclusion. And we also have department services like legal services, privacy protection services, and IT services. So the second phase is the design phase. This co-design phase was just launched, and the School of the Public Service supported us. And during this co-design phase, we put together a group of 30 employees from the public service. And these employees are from employment equity groups or employment-seeking equity-seeking groups. So they follow a 3-month training process so that they can become familiar with design and so that they can find solutions for self-identification. So the solutions that will be developed during that phase will increase the response rate And we're also trying to understand the experience faced by these people. So we may need to adjust the operational system during the implementation phase.
C'est la recherche et le processus de conception pour la troisième phase. Donc ça, c'est la mise en œuvre et les essais. Donc au cours de la troisième.
So during the third phase, we'll be doing testing on a new questionnaire based on the previous steps. This will do a behavioral insight study, and this will allow us to facilitate execution. This will be implemented in some departments and it will be expanded gradually to the whole of the public service. Now, in addition to this new questionnaire, we want to focus on communications, behavioral questionnaires. Why? Because we know that there is confidence in the system, there's confidence in the data as well, and there's confidence in the sharing of that data. Clear and transparent communications will allow us really to build a better confidence in the system. And once again, we'll use behavioral studies to help us with that, and we'll be providing technical support for the execution of these tests with other departments across the government. And finally, all that is designed to develop recommendations on the system. Based on the conclusions, we will be developing a report which will put forward recommendations for the whole self-identification process, the governance of data, the overall experience of users. In these statements, we'll put forward those results, and that'll be the basis for building a new improved process. And I would just like to add, to conclude, that this is an intensive research process that we've started here, even though it's focused on self-identification, which is a very important project, an initiative, especially as far as data is concerned. We do hope that this information and the experience that we gather and the data that we're able to bring together through this process can be used in the whole inclusion and diversity ecosystem. Thank you very much for that, and thank you for listening. Over to you, Wendy. Thank you very much, Jendi. I think that many in the community are looking forward to the new process, and we'll have the opportunity today to talk about that in more detail, I hope.
Paula Spivak, thank you for joining us, Paula. So we heard from 3 speakers from within the public service, and it's my pleasure to welcome you today to bring a perspective from outside the public service, and in fact from the area of the discipline of the volunteer world arena. So over to you, Paula. Welcome.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for this incredible opportunity for dialogue and understanding us better. One of the things that we are aware of at Volunteer Canada is that when we think about civil society, it used to be thought that that was in the domain of the nonprofit sector. But as we all know, all of you that work day in, day out, the voluntary sector and the public service both have a shared interest in the quality of life of Canadians and resilient communities, and seeing each other as partners and collaborators. And we're also on the same journey to look at the issue of diversity and inclusion within the nonprofit and charitable sector. I wanted to start off by reading something very quickly. It was the accord between the Government of Canada and the voluntary sector signed in December 2001, and signed by Jean Chrétien and leaders in the nonprofit sector. And what we did was we identified our shared values and the basis on which we would collaborate. And so we look at democracy, active citizenship, equality, diversity, inclusion, and social justice. And what's interesting about that, the commitment that the federal government and the nonprofit sector made to work together on those things, is that those values are very much in play today. And we each look at ourselves and say, how many things have we accomplished over the last 20 years since we signed that accord, but also how much more there is to do. And I think it's with that spirit that I wanted to share with you a little bit about our experience in the sector. So as you know, when we think about diversity, equity, and inclusion, you often see on the website of a nonprofit organization these listed as organizational values. And yet, when you look deeper, there isn't the opportunity or the ability to put those into action in the way that we would like to see. So, for example, if you look at boards of directors, you do not see the diversity that you ought to see in an organization that's part of the community. And you may know that Senator Ratna Omidvar, who was the deputy chair of the Special Senate Committee on the Charitable Sector, identified this issue, and it was one of the recommendations in the Special Senate Committee's report to look at and encourage the CRA in the T3010, the Charitable Information Return, that organizations list and identify the diversity representation on their boards of directors. There's also an effort being made through Statistics Canada to also explore the level of diversity in boards of directors of nonprofit organizations. And why it's important to look at the boards is those are the decision makers. That's where you look at strategy and partnerships, and it's really essential that that be reflective of the community at large and society at large. In addition to that, when you look at the General Social Survey of Giving, Volunteering, and Participating that Statistics Canada undertakes every few years, again, there is some information on the diversity and various communities and their participation in volunteering and in giving, as well as the identification of barriers to those very acts. When I look at the role that volunteering plays in creating for individuals a sense of belonging, a sense of community, as well as opportunities to develop skills. It's often seen as a valuable vehicle for newcomers to consider as part of their integration plan. But beyond that, when you look at organizations and the importance of organizations creating welcoming and inclusive communities and organizations, that the benefits to organizations for engaging diverse volunteers really speaks to building their cultural competencies so that they are able to serve many communities. And secondly, looking at the ability to have new perspectives and comrades and colleagues that share values and that we all see ourselves in the organizations that we want to be part of. So the idea that diversity and inclusion in the nonprofit and voluntary sector is we're on the path and on the journey, but work has to be done for us to be able to understand some of the barriers, understand some of the practices for opening up. I mean, there's anyone who has studied group dynamics knows that if you have a group, every time you have a new person join, the whole group changes, as opposed to what often happens in nonprofit organizations that want to recruit new people to boards. They have this notion that we have to train someone and provide orientation to adapt and to be able to operate within the guidelines that we have in our organization. And we're really needing to work beyond that paradigm and say, any new person that comes into our organization, let's let them and be open to changing our whole organization. So I'll leave it at that. I wanted to just share that we're on the path together, that what's often called the parapublic or the nonprofit and charitable sector, we're definitely partners with you on this journey to create more welcoming and inclusive workplaces.
Thank you very much, Paula. It's really interesting to have you with us today and to hear this perspective as it touches all Canadians, and the Federal Public Service serves Canadians. So we want to be as representative as the Canadians that we serve. So it's really nice to hear from you and have you share those insights. And now we'll get started with our interactive Q&A session. So we have just under an hour. So for the first question, on a beaucoup parlé de les...
We've focused a lot on disaggregated data, but what does that really mean? And how can we use this data to move our work to deal with systemic racism and systemic barriers forward? Perhaps Stefan and Jason could start the ball rolling. I can take that question. In general, disaggregated data is data which is disaggregated based on various factors, population factors, for example. When you do an analysis of data, of public service data, for example, our tendency really is to focus on the positive and not on the negative. But we should use disaggregated data to analyze the same results in a different way, using different factors. You're going to get a different answer if you do that. You're going to get a different answer for a specific public or target audience or department. We can use disaggregated data really to get better results. That's really the importance and the value of disaggregated data. It's really to uncover hidden trends and systemic barriers that exist within the public service. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Stefan. Jason.
Kind of related to this. So as we're collecting disaggregated data, we're asking very specific questions to our employees for them to self-identify, as Kathy mentioned. One of the questions from our participants is with regards to gender. Can you speak to how that is evolving and how we are changing the collection of information related to gender?
Yeah, absolutely. So in the process that I outlined earlier, we talked about kind of a research phase and the co-design phase. So in the research phase, we've heard is essentially this question that the gender categories that we have in place aren't reflective of the people that are in the workforce right now, because the other option doesn't speak to them and their identity. During the co-design, we've chosen our participants for a variety of diversity reasons or diversity markers. So we have a very diverse group of 30 people, including members from the LGBTQ2 plus community that exactly identify as non-binary. And we're hopeful that their perspective and their experience can inform what is the best way to move forward with questions such as this. And to complement that, we also have members from Statistics Canada on our panels who have experience in these issues, and they can help advise and guide and answer questions based on their knowledge and experience in this realm as well. So I don't know what will result of the co-design, because that's just the purpose. It's driven by the co-designers and not by us. But I'm sure that questions such as this one will be addressed, and I'm hopeful that the new questionnaire will be as inclusive and respectful of all genders and as possible.
Great, thank you, Jason. Kathy, there's an interesting question that's come in as well from one participant, which I think you, in your reflections as you introduced yourself, would be, we'd love to hear from you on this one. It's with regards to, we spoke about staffing and some of the inherent barriers that exist there. How about our classification system? And for example, some of the basic requirements such as education that are linked to certain classification groups and levels. How do you think those may pose inherent barriers? to certain groups?
It's a good question. First of all, I have to say I have the utmost respect for classification officers. They do very technical, complicated work. It is very challenging. It's a unique field. So certainly they do a great job. One of the things that we need to do in the staffing world is start to look at how we have built our tools, our guidance, our products, and our structures. So for example, there are ways to be more inclusive. A lot of times, with regards to education specifically, we have qualification standards. And qualification standards for every group and level that we hire in the public service that talk about education and experience. So for example, you might see a degree as a requirement for a position. However, many positions allow for alternatives, such as an acceptable combination of education, training, and experience. So the question I would ask is, if both could work, why don't we broaden the scope to include both groups? Don't be exclusive. Now, the reason I ask that question is if we're looking to increase representation and if we're looking at the data and it's showing that individuals of a particular group, whether it be race, persons with disabilities, and so on, may have less opportunities to get education or degrees because of cultural trauma, right? There's a lot of factors that go into how people progress through the education system, get jobs, and what types of jobs they get. So when you're looking at that information, if you're looking to hire executives of a particular group in a particular geographical location, and none of those individuals have a degree, and that's what you've put on your poster, well, you lose and they lose. We have alternatives to look at. And what we need to do is, we've got a very solid structural framework around staffing and HR, and we need to look and peel back the layers. Something that we're doing in our own organization at Service Canada right now is Gender-Based Analysis Plus from a Black-centric perspective. And we are consulting with the community external to Government of Canada to talk about their stories and their experiences. And I did some of that stakeholder outreach. And a lot of what came through was that. How do I get through that staffing wall? Why does it have to be this way? Why is it that a degree is required to do this work? Can somebody explain that to me? If you're looking for somebody like me to do that, but most of us don't have that skill, how are we ever going to meet that? Right? And that's a lose-lose situation for us. So again, we're looking at peeling back those layers and looking at how we've built those tools, how we've built that guidance, and removing any biases we've inherently built. And then questioning, is this really what is required? And that's not to say that what's there is wrong. It could be that it's outdated. It could be that it could be modernized and updated to reflect a new reality. Jobs have changed a lot since those standards have been created. Public Service Commission does a great job. Treasury Board does a great job. So we have a great opportunity here to start digging into that system and looking at opportunities, not failures, but opportunities to change.
Thank you. Great. Very, very interesting here, and I completely agree. And I think our colleagues here on the panel from Treasury Board will also agree that there's a lot of ways to innovate within the structure even that exists in our current human resources legislated framework. There is another question that I do want to make sure that we're answering the questions from participants. So I'm going to read this one. It's a little bit long, and I welcome any of you to jump in to answer. Very interesting. An issue with achieving representation at all levels of the public service is that often committees working on HR policies or inclusion tend to be comprised mostly of people who don't belong to these groups. Or if they include individuals who do belong to these groups, these individuals are not in positions of power and are only included for representational purposes. How can we circumvent this problem when the majority of decision makers or senior positions in the public service or in HR teams are not held by diverse individuals? And welcome again, Caroline.
So Wendy, I'm not supposed to be a panelist on here, but I feel this question is quite important. And if I may, I'd be happy to at least take a first crack at answering it and then handing it over to others on the panel. So like the question's a factual one. Let's not fool ourselves. We're definitely, there's not enough there's not many people of color that are in some of those senior positions as the person has outlined, whether sometimes we're going to boards and we're not seeing a diverse board committee before us, for example, or the possibility that the people that are making some of the policies and decisions may not be as representative as we'd like them to be. Having said this, I do think that this is evolving, and a good example is Kathy herself, who has been in HR for quite some time, as she outlined, although doing something different now. But even the fact that we are starting to see that there's more diversity occurring in those positions. I'd also add that one of the things that I'm really pushing for within our department, and I'm seeing it collectively everywhere else, is doing a better job of being more representative and diverse on board committees. I mean, there's no reason why we cannot have more representative boards. And that in itself will help, first of all, to make the candidates feel more comfortable, but also the opportunity to be able to see yourself reflected in the positions you're hoping to attain. The other thing is consultation. I can assure you that in some of the policies that are being talked about, including the one we're discussing today, is being widely consulted, and that is with diverse groups of people. And I've witnessed that personally, have asked for that to happen specifically in the role that I play. I have seen that it's also echoed by other seniors within the federal public service. And there are, like FBEC being an example, there are bodies such as FBEC and other Black executive networks that are really championing that aspect of wanting to be consulted and help influence the change. So I'll just throw that out as an opportunity that I think is starting to begin that realm of change, in hoping to do a better job of making sure that the policies, especially in the HR space, are far more inclusive than they are today.
Thank you. Thank you, Carolyn. Great. The questions are streaming in, so I will just continue. This is another question from another listener here, another participant of our event today. As far as I know, data on religion isn't collected, and potentially, Jason, you could take this question. However, some groups, such as Sikhs and Muslims, face discrimination based on their religion. The turban and hijab make their religious background notable, and they face discrimination for it. Do you think data of this sort will ever be collected? What is currently being done in terms of data collection on this topic?
So, yeah, happy to answer that question. So the simple question is, the guidelines that or the minimum standards set out by OCRO doesn't include a question on this. Some departments may have it. We're still gathering the forms from each and every department. But what I will say is the questionnaire as it currently stands, is based on the Employment Equity Act. That's the legislation in place that has minimum requirements. In the process of our co-design, we haven't limited our participants to thinking about identity just in terms of the Employment Equity Act. We know there are gaps in it that are very obvious, and we're encouraging them to think of identity in the broadest terms possible, so that the future products that we land with and the recommendations that we land with, cast identity as wide as possible, so that all can feel represented by how they outline their responses on that. So I can't say for sure it will or won't be. I can just say it's something that I'm sure will be discussed, and stay tuned.
Excellent. And Stefan, you wanted to add something with regards to the PSCS, the public.
Yes. Yes. In the Public Service Employee Survey, we have a question on discrimination. And then for the employees that basically answer yes to that question, there's like series of follow-up questions related to the sources of discrimination, but also the nature and of discrimination. So one of the options is basically religion. So definitely we do collect some of the information. It's not official through the official self-ID process, but in the survey itself, that information is collected and potentially can be cross-referenced against the subgroups that are part of the visible minority employment equity group, that we can actually see how that information relates when it comes to religious discrimination.
Okay, thank you. And Kathy, I noticed you might also want to add something with relation to this question. Go ahead.
It's not necessarily related to the data, but more associated to the fact that, again, we have opportunities certainly to be more creative within the way we build our workplaces. As I mentioned when I originally spoke, it is especially challenging when you walk into an environment and people can easily identify you. So if it's a turban or, somebody's wearing a burqa or religious symbols, or you have dark skin, those are challenges. But again, the way we design our workplaces, now in a COVID context, our workplace might be home for safety reasons now, but the way we create that environment, the flexibilities that we have, whether it be with space for prayer mats, space for washing feet, times for breaks and things like that around Ramadan and other types of cultures. These are ways where we can build the trust and start to build awareness around practices of different groups and ethnicities, please, that will allow us to sort of break down some of those barriers around racism and discrimination. So I just want to put that little piece there.
Great, Paula, and you're nodding.
Well, I'm relating to that in a conversation going on in the sector is how do we design our volunteer opportunity position descriptions? And very often we don't realize we put something like must have 10 years experience, must be mature, meaning, and then you say minimum 35 years of age. Well, I'm more than 35, and some people may or may not find me mature, but we arbitrarily decide that certain numbers of years and certain circumstances will produce the qualities that you want. And when you challenge yourself to say, is that really the case? You realize not. And there was an incident that took place. There was a faith community that was also operating a food kitchen, and they were recruiting volunteers. Somebody went to apply, and part of the application, they were also asked to get it signed by a clergy stating that they were a regular worshiper. And they were taken aback by that. And when they actually decided to take it to the Human Rights Commission in that province, and it was determined that staffing a food kitchen, your religious worshiping was not a bona fide requirement of that position. And so that was, again, challenged. Similarly, if you want someone to provide victim support and you want them to be familiar with the court system, you could say that, but not that they must be born in Canada or have 15 years experience. So I think that there's a lot of discussion about what we're putting in our position descriptions and the assumptions that go behind that.
Yeah. And I think just in general, across many of the human resources domain, we're starting to also consider what we call our statement of merit criteria. So how we assess the requirements for the position. We're really looking at hiring people on their experience for sure to some degree, but also on their potential. Right. And one of the best ways for us to really eradicate barriers is to also consider those things. And that touches on some of what you had mentioned, Kathy, are those experience factors really required when you start that, or can they be learned? Right. So let's assess on potential, not just on what's on the paper. Great. Okay, back to our participants again. So as another question here, what work is being done via the Modernization Office to engage with job seekers wishing to join the public service? So engagement, advocacy, actually going out there and meeting folks on recruitment. I can speak a little bit to what the school's done. In addition, does the disaggregated data available via the PSC's recruitment system show that applicant base is representative of the workforce availability? Now that's an interesting one. It would be the disaggregated data collected on applicants rather than indeterminate or our workforce, our hired workforce, but rather the disaggregated data on applicants. I guess I will punt that one over to Jason for the second part of that question. Does that disaggregated data exist? Do we have that at the Public Service Commissions for some of the larger recruitment campaigns?
So I mean, I won't speak for the PSC, But I know that part of the issue with kind of self-ID data or self-declaration data, which is what happens in the hiring process, is that there are multiple points of entry with these two systems that we spoke of today, but more as well, where people are asked to self-identify, and that we don't do as good of a job as we should to connect those dots and to understand the different systems. So they do have their own set of data. And maybe Steven can speak to how it's disaggregated, because I think he's the data guru. But we do know that one of the things we're trying to fix is have the systems speak to each other, so that and make it easier on the user to understand that data and understand the representation at each stage of the hiring processes and employees' careers.
Yeah, I can make a comment on that topic. I know because historically the data collected by the Public Service Commission, it's now getting really technical, is based on self-declarations. So people actually self-declare when they apply for a staffing process. And historically it has always been considerably higher than the representation results based on the self-identification. So the self-identification data is collected once somebody is actually hired in the public service. So there was a considerable number of employees that would not self-identify once they actually get hired into the public service. So there was always that gap when it comes to the data that PSC was collecting from their applicant system and the actual data that was managed by the Treasury Board of Canada. Several years ago, we did make an adjustment, and we actually took data from both systems and we actually reconciled it. But there are still certain gaps that have to be addressed between the data collected by PSC and the officially reported data by Treasury, because some people, they still decide not to self-identify once they are actually hired into the public service.
That's really interesting. I mean, I think if we unpack this a little bit, it really gets back to what Kathy was speaking about in her, in the story that you told, is very personal experience as a 16-year-old who was asked to self-identify in order to secure that first employment. On some regards, it was well intended, but in other ways, it maybe wasn't as well received. So I think this is an important piece, is that if we continue to ask the information in the old ways without actually reaching out to these communities, making them understand why we're collecting the data, what the intent is, and speaking to the applicants themselves, I think more work maybe needs to be done in that domain. Kathy, over to you if you wanted to add any comments there.
I just wanted to add that you're touching on something that's really fresh right now for us, in that, the clerk has indicated that as a government of Canada, we need to be representative of the people that we're serving. And that's something that we're taught day one in staffing, as you know. And one of the challenges that we have right now is he specifically says Black persons, Aboriginal persons, and persons with disabilities. But the way the Employment Equity Act was designed when it was very first established doesn't actually have that kind of flexibility in it. And what we're looking at right now from an HR perspective is, geographically, the needs of diversity are obviously different from one end of the country to another. We have populations, Indigenous Black communities in Nova Scotia. We have an immigrant population, but obviously not as significant as, say, Quebec or Ontario, and out in West, right? So who is needed in terms of representing that community becomes very specific. Likewise, accessibility roadmaps. The Accessibility Act is a big deal. So if we're looking to hire individuals who may have a visual impairment, for example, for a particular job, or we're looking to hire an Aboriginal person from a particular band or group to represent that community in the workforce, it's not actually clear how we can do that legally based on how the Act exists now. So I've asked my HR, I love my HR, some very tough questions to say, this may represent a little bit of a barrier right now if I can't actually go and hire, say, a priority who is Black, or from a particular Indigenous group, or a particular persons with disability, depending on the need. And the sensitivity there is targeting a particular group. So it's an important question when we look at, you know, what is the need? Why are we hiring somebody? And what type of representation is required in the location we're looking? So again, lots of potential there. And, you know, there's lots of people like me and like my colleagues on the panel out there poking and asking questions and pushing for those types of changes so that we have those flexibilities. Because right now the systems don't necessarily speak to each other all the time, as noted by Stevan. And that's really something that we need to correct. The system can't dictate how we do our jobs. We dictate what we need from the system, and so to speak. And you know, we're not going to get into technology there, but definitely one of our challenges.
Mm-hmm. And so I just wanted to mention that one of our listeners today, one of our participants from the Public Service Commission, confirmed that they do collect this data, which I think we all suspected, and that they would be glad to share the data and pursue a discussion offline. And then Jason, did you have anything to comment on that?
Just to add that yeah, absolutely. And it's just like I mentioned.
Oui, comme je l'ai dit. C'est un détail technique, c'est évident qu'on devrait le faire, mais c'est une barrière néanmoins. Et au final, on essaie que ça soit aussi simple que possible pour que la personne s'identifie. Et des systèmes multiples génèrent une confusion dans le système d'auto-identification. On a une autre question intéressante.
Which is the relationship and the considerations when we want to increase diversity, equity, inclusion in the workforce. Many of our visible minority communities, Indigenous communities, they don't speak the second official language. So this sometimes comes into conflict with the necessity within the federal public service to meet the official language requirements, especially in the higher level positions where we see now that supervisors and above should meet the CBC second language profile. So the question here from the listener is very for many visible minorities and Indigenous employees, there may be a need to learn at least a third language to be eligible for certain positions. Is this impacting, in your experience as panelists, is this impacting the representation of minorities across the organizational hierarchy? And Caroline, I see that you've joined us again.
So this is definitely a challenge. Let's, again, not mince words here. That is what sometimes can be the barrier to the vertical movement of those that do not speak our official languages, right? But what we have to recognize, especially for those of us who are in the bilingual parts of the country or where it's required for us to speak both French and English, especially in the management positions, that is a requirement of the public service for all positions. The part we need to continue to do better at, and it's very much in the conversations in terms of how we can continue to improve the way in which we are as a workplace and our workforce, is how do you make those opportunities of being able to access the language training or the opportunities to have the time to do the language training equitable to all. And that's fundamentally probably part of the issue. And I'll speak to IRCC, for example. So where we do feel that when we compare ourselves to the workforce availability, as per some of the questions that were asked previously, we're probably not bad in terms of being represented, but it's clear that we're not as represented as we'd like to be as we proceed up in the ranks. And that is probably in large part due to language. Maybe not the only reason, but just one of the barriers. And it's one that we're hearing clearly when we are consulting, or that when the Federal Black Employee Caucus speaks to us, is clearly, I'll use a term, a barrier or a challenge. So this is, I'd say, something that is definitely in the forefront of the actions that need to come to, that we need to continue to tackle through. But for me, the more important part is you have to be able, first of all, willing to want to learn that other language, because let's be clear that the requirement of the two official languages of our country is not going away anytime soon that I'm aware of. And if anything, the speech from the throne talked to the commitment of our Official Languages Act. So just let's be clear that this will be something that will exist for some time. But there's also a value to recognize that people speak more than French and English, and that comes in handy sometimes in other aspects of the delivery of our positions across the country and internationally. So I know I'm not giving a great answer. I'm just more being frank about the fact that this is truly an issue we face and one that we need to tackle, across the board.
No, I think that's really appreciated. I think many Canadians really pride ourselves on the fact that our identity is solidified with two official languages. It's one of the great distinctions within North America that makes Canada so unique, as well as all of the other languages that people bring within their ethnic origins. So, Kathy, there's another question for you, if you don't mind joining us for this one. You make an excellent point that trust, sorry, I thought this was Caroline, but it's for Kathy. You make an excellent point that trust can be a problem. So when you were talking about trust in your welcome remarks, it also resonated with me. I think this is one of the impediments that we see with people not wanting to self-declare or self-identify. So where people from underrepresented groups don't want to self-identify as being from those groups because they don't trust what will be done with the data, i.e. the sense of being tracked rather than represented, as you had said. Have you encountered any successful examples of concrete ways to build that trust? And maybe Paula, you might have an example as well. So over to you, Kathy.
Sure. So it's a tough one. And, as Caroline noted, I'm going to be obviously very, very transparent as well in that I find the biggest issue is that the data goes in. So you get the buy-in and, we self-identify and the data goes in, but nothing comes out of it. One of the big complaints that I do hear from equity and diversity staff is there's that organizational requirement on every advertisement that says if you are one of these employment equity and diversity groups, please specify as we may use this to hire. And employees will say, but you never use it. Right? It's used for statistical purposes. This is how many visible minorities applied. This is how many Aboriginals applied, and so on. And there's no result. There's no concerted effort on a sustainable level to address the issue of, can we get into those positions? It's usually, for me personally, it comes down to concrete results, giving the data in to say, I'm going to self-identify, I'm going to give this information, and I want to see something concrete coming out of it. That might not mean a job. It might mean fairness. It might be training. It might be the investment. So one thing I would say to the previous question is, we spend money on a lot of things. I think we need to invest in language training in areas for specific groups and cultures that maybe have not had access to it. Make a concerted, deliberate effort to spend that money to get them to the language levels they need, for example. So it's taking concrete action and using that data to make change. And unfortunately, we do fall down. We have a lot of 3-year plans, and that's become a bit of a dirty word to staff. Here's the 3-year plan on equity and diversity, and here's all of the things that we're doing. And it's become a bit of a paper exercise historically. So we have a reputation for taking in the information and then not following through. So my viewpoint would be that we need to, no matter what plan we create, do something deliberate and create results. So for example, in the Atlantic region, the Atlantic Federal Council is sponsoring a program called Building Black Leaders. And it was brought upon a question raised by the Federal FBEC, sorry, I'm forgetting, Federal Black Employee Caucus, excuse me. And they asked about representation at the decision-making level. And the Federal Council group said, yeah, we need to address this in a bold way. So now we're running a program that is going to elevate highly skilled Black public servants as a pilot project into positions at a decision-making level. And we're going to give them the training and the foundations to support that, which will include language training, supports and evaluations and leadership tools from the Public Service Commission. It's supported by, representation from OCAL, and other organizations are also creating programs to get equity and diversity groups at that decision-making level and providing access to tools and resources they typically haven't had access to. So we're starting to get that. In order to participate in the program, you may have to self-identify, but there will be a result. There'll be something concrete. And that's where I think we're going to start to build that trust. That's just my thoughts on that.
Thank you. Paula.
One of the things that occurs to me in terms of building trust in this area and in other areas is authenticity. I think that very often we become aware of a need to be more diverse and almost approach it in, for lack of a better word, a checklist approach, as opposed to an authentic interest in seeing the mutual benefit of a diverse workplace or volunteer force. And that happens very often on boards where there seem to be initially good efforts to reach out, but there isn't an authentic interest in the whole person, that the only thing that's seen is how they can add to the diversity representation of a board, as opposed to an authentic connection to the mission of the organization and to the skills and to everything else people bring. And I think so. I think authenticity does build trust.
Indeed, indeed. Stefan, you wanted to add something as well?
Yeah, I just want to make one comment because I was reading this question and find it quite interesting because I've seen this type of question, at least the front part, when it comes to what do we do with data? Are we basically tracking people? Like, how do we safeguard information? So I just want to basically share some information with the conference participants, because I get these type of questions almost on a daily basis, especially during the PSTS administration period, because people think that their managers will be able to see their survey results also from the workforce data perspective and self-ID perspective. So all of the personal identifiers are always removed from the survey's data. Also, the data is always suppressed if there's less than 10 respondents, both on the survey side, but also in our workforce databases. So from the employment active perspective, if there's 10 employees less than 10 employees in certain departments, in certain region, by a certain occupation group, that information is suppressed. So data is really safeguarded and it's protected by the Privacy Act and the Employment Equity Act. So from that perspective, as I said, it's a common misconception that folks have, and of fear basically data being misused for tracking purposes, but that definitely is not the case, especially on the TBS side, because we actually have the information for the whole federal public service workforce, both their perceptions and also their workforce information.
That's actually a great point that you touch on, and I'd love to just quickly elaborate on it. I do see questions rolling in, but I think the smaller departments and regional offices, how is it that we are able, I mean, we talk about not drilling down into disaggregated data if there's less than 10 voices, basically, respondents. So how are we able to then use that information? I think Kathy spoke about this as well. We still collect the information, but how do we ensure that it is protected and that we're still making decisions based on this? Stefan, do you have reflections on that?
Well, I can just give my point of view because I'm not 100% sure how things are basically managed by small department agencies. But the advice that we usually provide and the information that we usually provide, we provide reference points. So, for example, from the survey perspective, we always group micro and small agencies together when we actually provide results if they don't have enough respondents so they can actually compare themselves to something. At the same time, for me as a data person, even if I know that I have less than 10 employees that says, let's say that they have been harassed, for me, the fact that there's somebody being harassed is still an issue that needs to be addressed. From self-ID perspective, if you have certain targets from the workforce ability perspective that you need to achieve, you still know that you have less than 10 people in these certain groups and subgroups, so there's still work to be done. So it doesn't give you maybe precision that we would like to have, but it gives you strong indication of the trend or the issue that you are trying to resolve within your organization. So for me, the fact that that it's between 1 to 10 employees, well, 1 to 9 employees said something, or they're being represented in a certain category, it's still a valuable business intelligence to make your HR strategies and effective decisions based on evidence.
Yes, indeed, indeed. Jason, you wanted to add something as well.
Yeah, because I think an important part of kind of being transparent and being user focused here with self ID data is to take into account what people would like their data to be used for, and that changes from person to person. So I know we've explored the concept of tiered consent, sorry, or different types of consent. So they can say, yes, I want it used for statistical purposes, or yes, I want it used for statistical purposes and hiring purposes. And they can opt out of different things. So I know that definitely complicates the matter. It's not the simplest approach, but it does allow for a tailoring of what the information is used for and why. And I think that can build trust in the system as well.
Excellent points. Okay, I think we have time for maybe one more question. And this one is an interesting one, and I think it's on the top of many people's minds. When will the Employment Equity Act be modernized to reflect society today and to allow for disaggregation? So, for example, visible minority is a huge category and doesn't acknowledge that different peoples of color have diverse experiences. I mean, we've touched on this in the past. There's also been reference to this term racialized peoples, and that this will be substituted within the new Employment Equity Act when there is an update. Is that true? Do any of you know?
I'm going to make a comment about the first part, not necessarily on the act, from the act perspective, how it's going to be changed, but when it comes to pure data perspective, since we do collect the information by subgroups, both in the workforce data, in the Employment Equity Data Bank, but also more specifically in the survey. That question was introduced in 2019, so we can actually see if there are any differences between the subgroups of visible minorities, not only visible minorities overall. So we can actually see how, for example, Asian employees compared to the Black employees and other subgroups that exist within that Employment Equity group. So definitely disaggregation there, the information is there, and we know exactly what are the lived experiences of these employees and these communities within our workforce. When it comes to the changes to the E-Act, unfortunately, I cannot make comments on that. That's more like kind of a policy question. But from the data perspective, the information is there. It's basically up to us to decide how it's going to be used and if that's going to be used in a way to enable effective decisions based on the evidence.
Yes, and I think there's other communities who are also awaiting with impatience some updates to the Employment Equity Act, such as other equity-seeking groups, including the LGBTQ community, which currently is not identified in the Employment Equity Act. On the note, before I go over to Kathy, I know she wants to add something, but in terms of the subcategories of the current subcategories that are used for employment equity and which correspond with, I believe, the Statistics Canada workforce representational data, can you speak to when were those made, and are we looking at updating the groupings, the subcategories that are listed?
I can make a comment on the work that we had done for the public service employee survey. So as you already mentioned, in the past we were basically trying to align ourselves with the census information and also the information that is subject to the Employment Equity Act. So I know from the workforce reporting perspective and the Employment Equity annual report, we are kind of bound by the Act to have certain subgroups. However, PSCS is not bound by the Act, so we have more freedom to kind of innovate and experiment. And as a result, for example, this year, the persons with disability definition that's being used for the public service employee survey is actually much broader. It's aligned with the Accessible Canada Act, not the EE Act. So it actually captures a broader person with disability community. Also, we made some wording changes to add more precision to subgroups within the person with disabilities, but also for the indigenous employees. So we're trying slowly but steadily trying to kind of push the border and have as inclusive questionnaire from the PSS perspective as possible, but also giving some intel that can potentially be used by our policy folks when they actually look on how to modernize the EE Act and the other data sources and information collected across the enterprise.
Excellent, excellent. And Jason, you wanted to add something on this.
Yeah, so all that to say, I'll echo Stefan's comments that we can't comment on the legislation itself, but will say that I think we're equipping our co-design participants and people that are working towards modernizing self-ID with the contacts and the information to be exploring these questions. And I know specifically the term racialized has come up already in our research and in our co-design, among others, new terms and new language. And so we're working collaboratively with other departments such as StatsCan, as I mentioned, but also with our policy folks to land on modernized language.
Excellent, excellent. Kathy.
I was just going to say, obviously, I don't know when or how the EE Act is going to be modernized, but look forward to it. I think sometimes it does come down to the way we have interpreted things and maybe changing that interpretation. Those are some of the maybe easier or faster ways of mobilizing, which has been done in staffing in some respects. I was going to also comment and laud the work that Jason and Stefan have referenced in terms of the contributions that they will make significantly in their organizations to that type of work. One of the things that we do need to be aware of is, as Jason just noted, the choice of words. So some individuals find words like racialized to be very offensive. It's a bit of stigmatizing. Racialized, it rings sometimes a victimization, but it depends on who you talk to. Sometimes individuals will say the new term BIPOC is offensive. It puts us in that category of visible minority. You're putting us all in one bucket again, right? So there's a lot of sensitivities. It's complicated. It's evolving. So as Jason had noted, finding the right words is tricky work, and I look forward to seeing what is come up with, and happy to hear that there's lots of consultation that Jason referenced, that Stefan referenced, that is coming forward, because how this plays out is going to be a big deal for those groups that it impacts and how we move forward.
That's right. And I think it brings us back to the question from one of our participants with regards to what really was the intent of the Employment Equity Act, was to allow for a more equitable workforce in order to alleviate some of the discriminations and marginalizations that happened. So at that time, it was those four groups. But has this evolved? Well, we certainly can state that when we are visibly showing, for example, our religion in the case that was mentioned today in terms of being Muslim or a Sikh, and we're wearing symbols of such, now we could be seen as visibly showing our difference. And that also, one could argue, I've heard the same for racialized peoples. They said, well, what about the Romani communities? I'm not a visible minority as per the regular definition, but there has been inherent discrimination amongst my community as well. And where will that be captured? So these issues, I don't think, are necessarily directly cut and dry, even across color, let's say. And we see that with the LGBTQ as well. So thank you very much. We've run out of time. There's just 2 minutes left. But I wanted to personally thank everybody for participating in today. I think we had a very interesting discussion, and I will just then turn to some closing remarks, but I want to give you one last chance if there's anybody who wants to add anything before I say the closing remarks. You guys good? Okay, thank you. Just a really interesting discussion today, and it was a pleasure to moderate it today with all of you. So cela conclut la période des questions.
This concludes our question period, and thank you very much for sharing your questions and comments with us today.
Caroline, as well as Kathy, Paula, Stevan and Jason for being part of today's discussions. I'd also like to thank all of you as our virtual listeners and participants for attending and contributing today. I hope that you've enjoyed the discussion, the complexity, and we've hopefully left you with things that resonate and that we will continue to think about, as well as feeling inspired in terms of the direction and the work that's undergoing to advance these issues. Votre rétroaction est
your feedback is very much appreciated for the school, so I encourage you to fill out the electronic form that you will receive over the next few days.
Events, and so now I will just encourage you and plug them for a moment to check out our website regularly and tune in for many of our other amazing learning activities. So for example, on December 11th, we'll be hosting an event on supporting the recruitment, retention, and career development of Indigenous employees. So please join us to discuss these initiatives, how we can learn how to better support our Indigenous employees. And also for those of you who may or may not know, there is a CSPS podcast, which is called Innovate on Demand. The next episode will feature Anil speaking about our chief statistician, speaking on the data revolution and its implications for the Government of Canada. The Innovate on Demand podcast is free and it's available on our CSPS website, and you can also download it in your Apple or Google podcast stores. So once again, thank you very much, everyone, for participating today, and I wish you all a happy afternoon.